58 years ago today, on March the 14th, 1964, Jack Ruby was convicted by a jury of murdering Lee Harvey Oswald in front of the world to see, live TV. I remember that. I was sitting on my floor in my living room. Schools had closed when the president was shot, and we were all sent home. And there was nothing on, however many channels we had back then, the 3 networks and 1 New York station. So there was nothing else on but news of the assassination. It was in black and white. So he was convicted. Ruby never said he was part of a conspiracy, despite his words being mangled by those crazy people who want a conspiracy. He said he did it because he was outraged. And if you know a little bit, he was outraged at what Oswald had done. If you know a little bit about his background, it makes sense. He was a badly traumatized human being. He was born Jacob Rubenstein in Chicago on the west side, and in the Lawndale district near Maxwell Street, and it had 50,000 people per square mile. His father, Joseph, was abusive. He was a heavy drinker. He beat his much younger wife, Fanny, regularly, and they had been tossed together in an arranged marriage back in Poland. Franny Rubenstein, for her part, wasn't too stable either. She was full of her own demons. She beat and verbally abused her kids regularly. A redhead with a bad temper. Doctors called her uneducated, crude, and emotional, unable to control her outbursts. She was sent to a series of mental asylums, and Jack Ruby was eventually ordered by a court. He flunked out of 3rd grade because he just barely didn't go. He just barely didn't attend school. He finished the 8th grade by some sort of miracle, but he was sent to foster homes, bounced around a great deal. He had a friend in Barney Ross, the remarkable prize fighter in the 1940s. And what they did was to scalp tickets at sporting events, and they ran numbers for the Capone organization, but thousands of teenagers, little kids did that. It doesn't mean he was related to that at all. He was, in 1933, he traveled to California with a group of guys, and he was involved with selling tip sheets at mob-owned tracks. And he may have been involved with the mob's lucrative Mexican marijuana fields that they were growing. Lucrative business. He returned to Chicago. He got involved with the Scrap Iron and Junk Handlers Union, Local 2467. He worked there for $22.50 a week as it depends on who you talk to. Some say he was an enforcer. I don't see why they would need an enforcer, or a union organizer. My bet was because he spoke rapidly. He was one of these guys who stood up inches from your nose and talked. And I think he was just a union organizer. There was Leon Cook, was the guy who founded the union. He was a lawyer by training. And what he was trying to do, he was a good man. He was trying to raise wages for people who worked in the union. And unfortunately for him, in the late 1930s, with Prohibition over, the mob started moving in on more and more unions, no matter how tiny they were. And this was a tiny union. There's a punk named Johnny Martin. He was a small-time hustler. And he worked for a big-time hustler in Hood named Murray Humphreys, who was a big shot in the Chicago mob. And Humphreys gave this guy, Johnny Martin, permission to move in with the scrap iron workers. So by moving in, he'd run it and so forth, and he'd pay Humphreys something, and Humphreys in turn would pay the overbosses in the Chicago mob. It was a common theme. Nobody's really sure what happened, but when one day Leon Cook ended up dead. It was a power struggle. Cook was shot dead. Martin more than probably did it. He got away with it. Jack Ruby was a suspect for a short time in the shooting, and he made a big deal. Ruby made a big deal out of that he was responsible for it. Was in question for the shooting and so forth. But according to him, he loved Cook, and he would have nothing to do with it. But he stayed on in the union. It's just an odd twist of fate that years later, during the McClellan hearings, Bobby Kennedy reinvestigated Ruby's role in Leon Cook's murder, and he concluded Ruby had nothing to do with it. But he did say that Tubbo Gilbert, who was Cook County's incredibly corrupt, the world's richest cop, was responsible for backing up the takeover of the Union. After that, Ruby hit the streets. After that, he hustled around. He didn't really. He bounced. He moved to the junk handlers and eventually worked. He may have worked. Let me say that. For Alan Dorfman as a bagman, a collector. And then he moved over to a guy named Zucky the Bookie, Benny Zuckerman. That was a gambler, a big shot time power in the 21st Ward. But he ended up dead. Dorfman, by the way, would end up dead many, many years later. Ruby then bounced out to Texas, where in 1947, him and his sister Eva, who he barely knew, they opened a nightclub, restaurant, Singapore Supper Club. It was named after a mob hangout on Rush Street. He had other bars. Ruby had other bars named after mob hangouts. And he changed it eventually to the Silver Spur. He was involved, kind of, sort of, in some other mob stuff, kind of. When the Kefauver Committee came into Chicago, the committee's lawyer, Lou Kuttner, who was a thief, he arranged to make sure that certain people, for kickbacks, that certain people, like in the mob, didn't have to testify, because he would tell the members of the committee they weren't important. And one example here is he lied about who Ruby was. He said Ruby is this is a quote, syndicate lieutenant who had been sent to Dallas to serve as a liaison for the Chicago mobsters there, and Ruby was the payoff man for the Dallas Police Department. Nah, I don't think so. He was nicknamed Sparky because his temper was insane. All of his life, his temper was insane. And he once beat a man senseless in his bar for no apparent. He asked for a clean glass or something, and Ruby beat him and kicked him all the way down the stairs. The girls who worked for him knew strippers, knew how to deal with him. And they usually just robbed him blind. He was willing to give them any money for any reason at all. So between that, his temper tantrum, his abnormal love for animals, dogs, he was a weird, crazy person. A guy like that's not going to hang out in the mob too long. They don't want people like that, even in the mob in the 1940s. They want you to lay low, be steady. They don't need loons like Ruby, jumping up all over the place and threatening people and causing problems. His name, by the way, when he did talk to Rudolph Haley of the Kefauver Committee, he just didn't know anything. And he wasted Haley's time, as Haley said, and he wasn't called to testify. And all the information he gave them turned out to be just made it up. Later on, his name kind of sort of came up when the mob did actually move into Dallas in 1950, and they reached out to the sheriff there, a guy named Guthrie, and they tried to pay him off, and it didn't work out. Ruby's name was mentioned involved with that, but I don't think he had much to do with it. He was, as I said from the beginning, a very damaged man, traumatized guy. And I believe what he said. He was just a highly emotional, and he flew off the handle, and he walked over and he shot Ruby. This is not a guy, if you were going to conspire to kill the President of the United States, you wouldn't want Ruby around. People avoided Ruby. They didn't want to sit with him. They didn't want to talk with him. They said he was a friend of the cops in Dallas. The truth is, if you talk to cops in Dallas, they said they crossed the street to avoid talking to him. They got free drinks in his bar. So to say that this guy was part of a massive conspiracy, I don't think so. This is a traumatized, damaged human being.